But I'd like to sort of offer 6 theses for your consideration. The first is that when we discuss trade, and our broader topic today is the relationship between economic partnerships and military partnerships across the globe, but especially in North America. When we discuss trade, the American people right now regularly jump to job change and job disruption, and there's a basic true fact that we should all have in common that we don't all have in common, which is that technology, not trade, is overwhelmingly the primary driver of job change and job disruption in America. That is, technology, not trade, is the overwhelming driver of job disruption in America today. Number 2, if you look at the effects of trade just from an economic standpoint, we're obviously going to get to national security implications of trade as well today, but if you look at trade just as an economic matter, it has been indisputably good for the U.S. Throughout history. This isn't academic theory, this is historical reality, and NAFTA in particular has been indisputably good for the U.S. It's also been indisputably good for Mexico, and it's also been indisputably good for Canada, and there's nothing internally inconsistent about those statements because trade done right is a win-win. And regularly in our public discourse, we don't talk about that clearly. So I think it's useful to unpack a little bit when you look at the economic ledger, how to think about the consumer benefits of trade, the producer benefits of trade, and then in reverse, if you look at more tariffs or more protection, the consumer costs of trade, the producer costs of trade, and then the retaliatory synergistic effects where you get costs again on consumers and producers as you cascade from one kind of protectionism to other types of protectionism. So my second thesis for you is that trade is indisputably good as an economic matter. Number 3, we have very little public understanding of what the term trade deficit means, and not understanding what a trade deficit is has huge negative consequences for our public deliberation about trade. So we should talk just a tiny little bit about what the term trade deficit means, and really we should fight hard, and I think for those of us who are in public life for a time, or those who are in the academic or the think tank world, or those of you in the journalistic community, I think we should regularly stop whenever someone says trade deficit and say, when you say trade deficit, do you really just mean trade product deficit? Because I assume that you do, but if we're going to talk about that, then let's make sure we also get back to the trade services surplus and the foreign direct investment surplus that the U.S. almost always has whenever we talk about a bilateral trade product deficit. So number 3, the term trade deficit is not well understood, and we can't deliberate well as a people about trade without unpacking a little bit about what we think we're saying when we say trade deficit. Number 4, the American people are not to blame for this confusion. This is overwhelmingly the fault of leaders to not talk clearly about where we are in economic history. And unless we go slower and we unpack where we are in economic history, there is going to be so much anxiety about job churn and job change, understandably, that people are going to look for boogeymen. And right now, trade is suffering a lot of the boogeyman negative consequences of us not deliberating clearly about where we are in economic history, because we are going through a time of radical change. The technological and in particular digital revolution that we are living through may well 100 years from now look in the rearview mirror as disruptive, not just to economics, but to basic human community as industrialization and urbanization. And if we're going through that kind of a revolution, we should have some sense of what we're living through so that we as a people can deliberate about it clearly. And this town is failing radically to have any meaningful discussion about where we are in economic history. And so a lot of what feels like Washington breaking down is Washington breaking down at the basic level of policy deliberation, but more fundamentally, it's Washington not having done the first thing of leading to help the American people have a big, broad conversation about what we think, what sort of problems are amenable to political solutions, and what sort of problems are probably not amenable to political solutions. When we unpack that, what I would say is that we're going through a time where there's such radical erosion of social capital, radical and rapid, that most people feel such hollowness in our lives, and as people who are meant to be relational beings, as people who are meant to be tribal beings, if our tribes are evaporating, we're still going to try to figure out a way to create tribe, and a really lame way to create tribe is by doing anti-tribe. But that's what's happening all around us, where people are saying, well, I don't have a lot of tribe, but maybe I can at least have the enemy of my enemy be my friend for a time, and we can be shared in what we're anti to. And right now there's a whole bunch of that going on, which is some of the reason that Washington doesn't look like it makes much progress on pragmatic, small ball legislative policymaking, because there's not a broader shared understanding of where we are in history. Number 5, and this is more than the McDonald's thesis of Sam Huntington and other people, but number 5, I would say that when you have lots of economic relationship between two countries or between a block of countries, when you have a lot of commerce between peoples, you end up building other kinds of relationships as well, which often have huge global security implications. This isn't really that profound. It turns out that you're less likely to go to war with people that you know and like and have shared interests with. There's really nothing profound about this, but when we talk about trade and we isolate it from global security and national security considerations, we're pretending that people are just disembodied, rational robot sort of calculators making decisions about what their interests are in the world, as if they aren't embodied people that have economic interests and communities and relationships and friends. And it turns out when you have a lot more economic relationship, you're much more likely to find shared understanding about global security matters, both for the good, sort of building alliances, but also for the avoidance of the bad. Misunderstandings tend to be dealt with better if you have lots of overlapping relationships. To take it from some of the literature about family breakdown that's out there right now, it turns out that people who have to practice marriage in the context of community are better at marriage than people who practice marriage without a lot of relationships densely packed around them. It turns out if you have a bunch of little bumps in your marriage, but you share lots of common friends, and you have family members, and you have neighbors, it turns out you can solve lots of problems that might otherwise spin out of control. The same is true in economic and military security. And 6th and finally, and reaching far beyond just our NAFTA discussions today, we should be clear about where we are in geopolitical competition over the coming decades. China has a plan, and we don't have a plan. China has a plan for where they would like to see global economic relations and global security relations go, and the United States right now surely doesn't look like we have a plan.